Zack gingerly grasped the next point of support with his hand. The two-story dilapidated house was in a state of disrepair, but the occupants, of course, are not yet thought of being moved out. From time to time, small repair works are carried out, and it is considered that so-and-so will do. They are waiting for everything to fall apart like a house of cards, and then they will start doing something urgent. It's all crunchy, and you can't wait for that ladder to come off the wall and collapse with him. Good thing he's not afraid of heights. Zack, you can do this. Don't be afraid, Grandma. The boy turned his head and looked down. Holding the skein of rope with his left hand, he lifted the attic hatch with effort. It's heavy. Closing it back would be even more awkward because of the old, barely holding hinges. The whole thing seemed designed to be as uncomplicated as possible. A light draft blew dust from the floor into his face, preventing him from taking a closer look at the attic. Zack sneezed loudly, shook his head, and tilted dangerously. Don't fall. Grandma was terrified. The second person after his mother who listens, gives sound advice, and strokes the top of his head, plus delicious food. No one can compare to her in that. Pulling the lid back, Zack pulled himself up and, trying to get his pants as dirty as possible, climbed in and lowered the rope down completely. "Grandma, why don't I do it myself?" he asked. No. She waved her hands, tying the empty bucket. "Are you going to climb up and down?" "No, you can't. It wouldn't be hard for me, and it would be faster." Zack mentally agreed with her and with quick hands lifted the bucket. The roof leaked from time to time in rainy weather, especially in the fall, when water began to pour from the sky. Repairmen were very reluctant to deal with this problem, trying to reduce the solution to other instances, those on the third. And as a result, residents put buckets in the most unsafe places. And when there were especially heavy precipitation, once every few days they climbed up to drain them. And since mostly elderly people lived here, there was a very limited number of water carriers. And it turned out that the uncle from the first floor went on vacation, and the other on a business trip. So Grandma called Zack. He was already going to visit her on the weekend with a sleepover, and will help the whole house. It's a good thing. Yes, and entertainment is not bad, because in this weather you cannot walk outside. The computer is already boring. On vacation even appears sometimes the desire to go to school faster. But when the last days of vacation are left, he will curse himself for these stupid thoughts. Look, we'll drain all the tanks, even if it's half or nothing. There should be 2 on your right near you and a few closer to the corners. See? All right, I'll take a look. Zack turned on the flashlight, which illuminated the darkness a little, and twirled his head around. The large, dusty room had a mysterious quality to it. It had been a while since he'd been here, but nothing had changed in those days. Only the arrangement of the buckets, and maybe the attic had gotten even darker despite the late hour. Small windows were the only things that gave off light besides the flashlight in his hand. Too weak, and there was no use for them. They kept the rain out, that's all. In the gradually fading twilight, if you turn on your imagination, it was as if you were in a gloomy, deserted castle, or a location from a horror game. The vague outlines of wooden beams and abandoned building materials seem eerie. It's like he's back in his childhood. The same silly kid, afraid of the boogeyman under the bed, ready to grab his foot out from under the blanket and drag his fragile body into the darkness. You're convinced that it's all fantasy and nonsense, but you still wrap yourself tightly in a blanket before going to bed, covering everything almost with your head, leaving only your nose unprotected, especially after watching a horror movie. Or as it is now in the corners of the room, shadows swirling in the light of a weak flashlight, like living creatures, black tentacles on the floor and walls, getting closer and closer to him. Fear of the dark is like that, making up things that aren't there, seeing things that don't exist. It's just a board leaning against a beam up ahead, or creatures hiding behind it, waiting for him to come. Closer. And what if he lifted his head and there was an eyeless thing hanging there with its jaws wide open? His heart hammered rapidly at that vivid image. Taking a deep breath, he directed the beam of light upward, carefully inspecting the black, hole-strewn roof. Naturally, there was nothing there. Zack. A loud noise came from below, causing him to clench his left hand in surprise. The bucket hit his toes painfully. I forgot. Why would he come down here? But he was scared. By birth. Putting the first bucket in exactly the same place, Zack headed for the hatch. hooked it on and carefully, trying not to bump it on the steps or spill water, lowered it down. Grandma went into the apartment to pour it out. The boy squatted down, relaxed, looking around the attic and guiding the flashlight around. The initial interest was gone, replaced by a desire to leave this place as soon as possible. Staying here was becoming less comfortable and more dangerous by the second. Dangerous? Zack himself was surprised that such a word appeared in his mind. This was just a dusty attic. What could be dangerous here? Nothing. The boy answered himself. It's just his imagination running wild. The work went faster. There was one more bucket left and we could go downstairs. And there are very tasty pancakes. Encouraged by these thoughts, Zack made a final effort and threw down the rope. There we go. Good for you, Grandma said, making the boy's cheeks blush. The helper has grown up. You go. I'll carry the last bucket myself when I get off. I'll make you some potatoes. Grandma smiled and went into the apartment. Zack clumsily fumbled with his foot on the first step. It wasn't made for humans, but for mutants. Every movement had to be careful not to fall down. He wouldn't crash, of course, but at least his legs would be broken. Bless you. Taking one last look around the attic, the boy frowned. What's that? Something crunching in the far corner. A faintly walking and, as it seemed to him, long silhouette instantly showed, just as quickly disappeared, dissolved into the darkness as if nothing had happened. But he definitely heard the sound. Maybe a cat? And where was it? To see what had made the noise, one would have to get closer. But would he have to? That urge to climb up again and examine all the details faded away, and a brisk descent, putting the incident out of his mind, struggled briefly in him. The crunching of a foot even louder, and already from another corner, closer to the boy. His heart hammered. Zack was in such a hurry to turn around that his foot slipped, and Zack managed to grab the edge of the attic at the last second. That was a lucky escape. Otherwise, he could have been down there. I'd have twisted a limb. Spitting on it, Zack quickly lowered the loft lid, trying not to pinch his fingers, hooked the hook, feeling the webbing on his head. He reached the floor in a few movements without looking up into the apartment, only there exhaling in relief. What an idiot. Scared of nothing. He reproached himself, but in his heart he was glad of this decision. The room was getting darker and darker, and rain was pouring from the sky. The sounds resembled drumming, and their rhythmic rhythm made him sleepy. Zack turned off the computer without waiting for Grandma's visit and collapsed into bed. He continued texting his best friend. After all, the guy was just finishing up on how he'd climbed the attic, not writing about his experiences. I saw something up there. The boy finally decided to write it. He didn't really see anything, but for some reason he still gets a shiver from those vague shapes in the corner. What do you mean? A quick reply from a friend. Animal like something sat in the dark. Even those typed words made it uneasy. Maybe there was a bum in there? He didn't think of that right away. No, it was something else. No, never mind. But it was flooded. What's he got? Did he take his cell phone with him? Judging by the rain, you'll have to do it again tomorrow so you can still get a good look. He was distracted from texting by a noise upstairs. Something dragged menacingly across the attic from the far corner closer to him, like a big heavy bookcase. Decided to move it? But the problem was, there was nothing that bulky upstairs. Sweat beaded on my hands. Who'd be up there at this late hour? And more importantly, why? Zack lifted his head from the pillow. The sleepy coziness quickly dissipated into the night. The silence, diluted only by the sound of falling drops, was getting on his nerves. The room had gone from a pleasant abode to a creepy and mysterious place. His t-shirt hanging on the chair was very distracting and tense, as if someone was sitting there. A message came on his phone again, but Zack didn't pay attention to it. Lightning flashed outside the window, making the guy twitch. He imagined a black spot on the ceiling, lazily moving toward the headboard of the bed. The noise didn't stop, heading toward him. It was as if the incomprehensible and frightening visitor knew exactly where the boy lay, seeing him through the ceiling. He wanted, as in childhood, to cover himself with his head under a blanket from all the threats and scary sounds. But Zack found the strength to get out of bed and hopped over to the table. He turned on the lamp, trying not to look at the chair on the ceiling. There was nothing, of course, but footsteps followed him again. The unknown man stopped right above Zack's head. There was a crunching of the ceiling. Then a low, menacing growl through the bricks and wallpaper made Zack tear toward the door and run out into the hallway. And the boy was immediately confronted by his grandmother. She was surprised at his grandson's tight embrace. He wasn't much for that kind of affection. "I got up to see how you were doing." "Me?" It seemed like a delusion and a dream. Zack was ashamed of his moment of weakness. No big deal. The storm, the shadows, the sounds, they're all commonplace. I thought I saw someone wandering around. "It can't be," Grandma replied confidently. "You must be confused. Maybe you heard a thunderstorm or a downpour." "Yeah." He rubbed his eyes. The fright passed as quickly as it had begun. He listened. "It's quiet upstairs. Go back to sleep. Don't be afraid of anything." There was no sound in his grandmother's room. Zack decided not to look in on her, so as not to wake her up. He opened the apartment door quietly, trying to make as little noise as possible. He carefully closed the door and made his way to the tantalizing entrance to the attic. Rustling and slurping sounds came from the open hatch. A wave of air rushed through his hair, making him twitch nervously at the unpleasant sensation. He'd locked the attic when he'd climbed in. Why was it wide open now? Without thinking about it, he flew upstairs in one breath. Only now he remembered that he'd forgotten his flashlight. He didn't need one, Zack muttered. His eyes would get used to the darkness. "We just have to wait a little longer." A barely audible whisper came from behind him. It was as if a ghostly, intangible creature lurked behind him. The boy turned around, but there was nothing supernatural. Or did he not see it? In the nearest corner, something was moving silently and muttering in an incomprehensible language, but it didn't move from its place. There was no thought in his mind that it was dangerous here, and he wanted to go backwards. Not even to go, but to run, risking a fall in the dark. No. He told himself that he must take a picture of the attic at night and not retreat. With the flash, take a picture. His friends would be frightened. But I could do it. Almost dropping the phone, Zack, trying not to shake and doing everything quickly, unlocked it and turned on the backlight. Grandma stood motionless in the dark corner, staring at him silently. That stare was uncomfortable, as was her face, slightly skewed to the side, as if part of her jaw had disappeared and her cheek along with her eye had slid down. She just stood there, silent. But Zack would have been glad if she'd uttered a single word. "Grandma," he said timidly, "what are you doing here?" His own voice sounded muffled and fake, like it wasn't real. Why did Grandma come in here in the middle of the night? And what was wrong with her face? The boy was afraid to take another step, but resettled himself. The board crackled under his foot, making his heart stir, and a searing wave ran down his arms, showing his fingertips. Grandmother stretched her toothless mouth until her lips cracked. Her head shook as if in a violent seizure. Her hands wriggled unnaturally. "Don't leave the hatch open. Don't leave the hatch open." She repeated it over and over, and with each word her voice changed more and more, becoming like a tape recording, deeper and deeper, forgetting and hoarsely stretching the vowels. Zack felt movement behind him. Turning around, he only noticed with the corner of his eye another creature leaping at him without a face and without an eye. It grabbed sharply and clawed at his face with the smell of rottenness from its mouth. Waking up, the boy, tangled in his blanket, could not quiet the beating of his heart for a long time. And only after an hour he sank back into a pleasant slumber. After such a terrible dream, he didn't want to go upstairs. But how could I explain to my grandmother? I saw something in the dark last night. And then I had a nightmare in which I was eaten by a monster. And to look like a little kid in front of her, especially after her praise, is undesirable. Zack smiled indignantly and climbed in quickly, forgetting about the closed hatch. "It's okay." The boy waved his hand and soon, scooting to the side for her to see, opened the hatch. A draft pulled habitually from there, blowing her hair around. But along with it, another odor from the dream hit her nose. Trying not to look around and put all thoughts out of his head, the boy set to work. The wind was hitting the glass, throwing leaves at him, making sounds unpleasant to the ear, the squeak of claws, as if an invisible creature were trying to get in here to eat the sweet child's flesh. "Think of something else, you fool," A bright day, a fun run in the park, a birthday coming up. As the boy approached the place that stank the most, he hesitated, examining it more carefully. The darkness reluctantly dissipated, exposing an empty corner, spreading out to the sides, trying to avoid the color of the flashlight. Relieved, he exhaled, drained the bucket, and headed for the hatch. I almost forgot. Zack clapped himself on the head. It would help with a little distraction. He smiled and took a picture of his face against the dark room. The bright flash blinded him a little, reminding him of his nightmare again. Now he would turn around and there would be a crazy, ugly grandmother standing there, mouth open, and grave worms would come flying out of there. Wouldn't he? And indeed, turning around, the boy found none of what he had imagined. Lowering his last hip down, Zack saw his grandmother in the apartment. Considering that he would carry everything himself again, the boy wanted to say something but changed his mind, though he didn't want to be here alone. He looked at the picture he'd taken. Seemed pretty good, despite the dark surroundings. But what is it? As he zoomed in on the right part of the shot, he saw a long black paw sticking out from around the corner. It stood out strongly and was like the real thing, trying to reach for his leg. There was definitely something behind him, and it could be felt with his back. Squinting his eyes, the boy noticed the darkness thickening around him. Fear instantly ran down his spine from bottom to top, taking one last jab at the back of his head. It felt like he was being watched intently. It had been there before, but now it was unbearable. Zack almost lost his balance. He threw himself down, forgetting about the fallen flashlight that had rolled sideways. He jumped down the middle of the stairs, his feet hitting the floor painfully. I hurried to leave this horrible place, but I didn't make it. A few steps to the apartment froze like a stumbling block. A terrible guess, like lightning, flashed through his head. He hadn't closed the hatch behind him when he was panicking, trying to get back to the cozy light world. He turned his head, looking up. A creature resembling a human with raised paws and multiple eyes on its face, swiftly moving its limbs around, was at his side. It grabbed him and dragged him up into the attic. The boy started fumbling with his fingers, trying to grab onto the wall or the stairs, but after a second, the screaming stopped. Like a movie paused. Grandma came running to the screams and saw only a bucket and a rope. The attic was quiet. Where did he go? The policeman who arrived at the call searched the whole attic without success, collected all the dangling cobwebs and ran outside. "What's going on up there?" shouted from downstairs a familiar doctor called by them. Granny's heart got bad after the call. "They're taking her to the hospital." "Found it." "No, there's nothing here." Mr. Kyle cursed in a low voice. Where could a boy in home clothes run off to? It was a mystery. Reaching the edge of the trapdoor, he took one last turn. This place was uncomfortable, straining him with its bleakness. It was even funny that after the crime scenes he'd been to, he was intimidated by the ordinary attic of an old house. But the darkness pressed unbearably on his nerves, especially the far corner, which he was the last to inspect. It seemed that he would turn away, and a monster, woven from the fears of his childhood, would materialize at once. Such sensations made him uncomfortable. His feet carried him away, and now he had only moved farther away when the shadows thickened again in the unfortunate corner, and an indistinct, long figure appeared. A heavy breathing collapsed in the depths of the attic. Listening, the man sensed some presence. Mr. Kyle climbed down too quickly for his size, remembering to slam the trapdoor shut. When he felt the floor beneath him, he wiped away the sweat with a trembling hand. You'd never see anything like this. The creature glittered and vanished into the darkness, not the least bit disappointed at the loss of its prey. It didn't want to catch him, only to scare him away. The boy it had devoured would last a long time, and it could wait. It waits very well,